Welcome to our last Goggio lecture of the. Today we end with the great guest, Dr. Caterina Romeo, who I was lucky to met years ago when I was doing my PhD in centuries ago. This book came out, Postcolonial Italy, and I think the book was really a key historic publication for the development of postcolonial studies in Italy. So to have you here today, we are particularly happy. So, Caterina Romeo is an associate professor at Sapienza University di Roma, where she teaches literary theory, gender studies, migration, and post-colonial studies. She's the author of 4 monographs, the most recent of which is Interrupted Narratives and Representation in Post-Colonial Literature. She has co-edited a volume and special issues, among them the collection Postcolonial Italy in 2012, and a special issue on the Journal of Postcolonial Writing titled Intersectional Italy, which in 2024 was selected as part of the Routledge Special Issues as Books program and recently published as a book by Routledge. She has translated the work of numerous Italian-American women writers, among them Louise de Salvo and Kim Ragusa. Her essays on postcolonial theory, postcolonial literature, representation of Italian Blackness, and Italian-American culture have been published in national and international journals and edited volumes. Caterina, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. I would like to start by thanking Angelica Pesarini for this invitation, and Luca Somigli also in the Italian department. It is really an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today. My lecture today is going to be, as you know, on the operation of decolonizing Italian literature and society, and through an approach that is at the same time postcolonial and intersectional. The structure of my lecture today is going to be divided roughly into 3 different sections. In the first section, I will discuss the importance of using the terminology of postcoloniality as opposed to others. We will see. In the second part, I will give a very brief survey of what has happened in Italian postcolonial literature in this 35 years since inception in 1990. And in the third part, if I still have some time, I will present a case study, the anthology Future, which came out in 2019. And I would like to say something about how we can use an intersectional and postcolonial. I'm going to start now. So the rise of Italian postcolonial literature is a phenomenon of great social importance, deep cultural relevance, and extraordinary literary significance. In recent decades, the deployment of a postcolonial perspective to examine Italy's past and present has considerably altered previously consolidated conceptions of national identity, as well as definitions of Italian literature and culture. Emerging at the beginning of the 1990s, in its initial phase, Italian postcolonial literature gave voice to migrant writers and the profound social changes that Italy was experiencing as a result of coming mass migrations from numerous locations across the world. In subsequent years, writers, intellectuals, artists, activists with a migratory background, who nonetheless did not identify as migrants, initiated the fundamental process of rewriting Italian colonial history and exposing systems of otherization and marginalization in Italy. In the early 1990s, Italian postcolonial literature has contributed to the reinvigoration of the numerous narratives, including cultural canons, disciplinary fields, documents, monuments, and memories that in ways, but through common trajectories, have constructed and stabilized the notion of an Italian national identity and culture, articulated within and only in national boundaries, and expressed almost only in the Italian national language. Such reconfiguration systematically challenges the notion of an imagined national homogeneity and I'm referring here to Angelica was showing to the subtitles of Postcolonial Italy, is precisely challenging national homogeneity, and calls for an alternative transnational and postnational understanding of Italian culture. Italian postcolonial literature, 35 years after its inception, which conventionally dates back to 1990, is far from widely accepted in Italy and beyond. The term postcolonial until a few years ago was, and I'm quoting, a clandestine word in the context of Italian studies in Italy. This was Roberto Bertis, a field that still struggles to acknowledge the cultural significance of this literary production. Italian studies, that is. The marginality to which Italian postcolonial literature is confined in Italy translates into a number of academic practices that tend to constantly delegitimize not only this body of literature, but also the critical and theoretical work associated with it. When acknowledging its existence, scholars generally have not defined this literature as postcolonial, but rather as migration literature. Over time, adjectives such as migrant, Italophone, post-migrant culture, intercultural, expatriate, dispatriate, translingual, and most recently, transcultural have been used to refer to this culture. The deployment of such terms, however, obscures the connection in Italy's colonial past and its ongoing legacy in the present, thus failing to address, interrogate, and critically examine the power structures established by Italian and European colonial systems and the ways in which these structures are still solidly in place in contemporary Italy. Such colonial legacies, visible through practices that severely limit the border crossing of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers from the global south, through practices that produce conditions of clandestinity and illegality, through processes of marginalization and racialization, and through limitations on citizenship. Postcolonial literature has achieved greater visibility in the Italian cultural landscape over the past decade, asserting its presence at cultural events, publishing industry, within educational programs, in academic publications, newspapers, magazines, and even at the most renowned national literary prize, literary award, the Premio Strega. However, its capacity to size the relationship between power and knowledge, and thus to interrogate who has the authority to claim a right to authorship, is generally not given due consideration, and the category of the postcolonial is still largely absent from the literary and cultural debate in Italy. Determining how to define and categorize literature written in Italian in Italy by migrant writers and their descendants, therefore, acquires a strong social and political value because it means reflecting not only on the criteria of inclusion and exclusion operated by the Italian literary and cultural canons, but also on who can be considered Italian and European and what the social and cultural of these subjects is and can be. It means interrogating what constitutes italianità and to what norm, be it somatic, chromatic, cultural, or other, it is necessary to conform in order to in this privileged category. A post-colonial perspective is the temporal and spatial connections that link Italy's many diasporas, and I'm here using the title of Donna Gabaccia's notorious book, across various historical periods and regions, revealing how transnational and international movements, such as mass emigration waves of international migrations from the south to the north, migrations, contemporary migrations, and so-called nuove mobilità, new mobilities, it's not a brilliant translation, have led Italians to occupy both dominant and subordinate roles in the past as well as in the present. Identify different migrations as a continuous process rather than as isolated events and incorporating them into national history makes visible that Italian national identity has at a national as well as at a transnational level. And this is a quote from the introduction to postcolonial Italy. A postcolonial approach also links contemporary Italy with other European countries involved in colonization or sharing a colonial legacy that continues to the social and cultural exclusion as well as the differential inclusion of migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and their descendants. The shared post-colonial condition of Italy and other European countries creates transnational connections between and among diasporic communities shaped by colonial legacies and weakens any nationalistic celebration of the nation. These links are akin to what Paul Gilroy observed among Black communities globally, who, through their common experience of the African diaspora, have developed shared traits and cultural expressions across different geopolitical settings. In recent years, national approach has influenced discussions that seek to redefine studies in the Anglophone academy on both sides of the Atlantic. Although this, I'm going to present now theoretical that come mostly from the UK. This debate has drawn from, I'm sorry, yes, has drawn from, and I'm quoting from Cristina Lombardi Diop's article, which came out on Forum Italico in 2023, from some of the progressive aspects of the post-colonial approach, and the quote, such as considering Italian history of colonialism, migrations, and mobility as basis for questioning the very notion of a national identity, and utilize terms from the post-colonial debate, quote, such as diaspora, transculturation, cosmopolitanism, syncretism, mimicry, agentic and subjectivity, contact zones, etc. End of quote. To advocate the necessity for a transnational turn in Italian studies, I'm referring here to Emma Bond's essay, that moves beyond national boundaries, whether in cultural, spatial, or temporal terms. If the idea to beyond national borders sounds attractive from a cultural point of view, as it promotes the exchange of personal and collective stories, cultural products go beyond the traditional literary texts, narratives articulated across locations and languages, the importance of translations, and so on, prove problematical from a social and political point of view. In contemporary Italy, in fact, preserving a national and in no way nationalistic perspective and the identity politics tied to it may be strategically necessary to protect the rights of migrants and their descendants. Concentrate on cultural processes, emphasizing fluid dynamics of identification rather than fixed ideas of national identity, and focusing on, and I'm from Burdett and Polizzi, the transnational dimension of cultural life, which looks at what people do, not on normative or idealized notions of identity and belonging, end of quote, can obscure the reality that among those fighting part in the process of shaping an Italian national identity are individuals and race in Italy who are still denied citizenship, which is predominantly granted based on biological racist principles. It may additionally conceal the fact that fluid dynamics of identification are not conceded to Black Italians who are often excluded from or differentially included in the national space. The recent discussion on the decolonization of Italian studies in the United States, on the other side of the Atlantic, on this side of the Atlantic, has underlined the necessity to defy systemic racism at large and its insidious infection in specific arenas throughout society, which include the academy, and to rearticulate Italian studies, quote again, with diversity, equity, and inclusion. As Rosetta Caponetto points out, the process of decolonizing Italian culture abroad must proceed jointly with the decolonization of Italian society in Italy, where the debate on race, colonial legacy, and post-coloniality needs to be further developed. The risk otherwise is to enact a decolonization that only has a performative function, and I quote Francesco Ricatti, developing dialogues that move us beyond our attempts to decolonize the curriculum while inevitably failing to decolonize reality, end of quote. Combining a transnational approach with the post-colonial colonial perspectives, more attuned to the power dynamics ingrained in societies and to the history that shaped them, can have the to generate transformative approaches to analysis and research that can contribute to reshaping Italian culture and society. I would now I would like now to proceed with a definition, a mapping, and a periodization of Italian postcolonial literature. and I will try to give you an idea of what has happened, as I said, in the past 35 years. This is the way in which I have divided the Italian literature into phases. Applying a postcolonial perspective to a field of studies that does not entail formulating applying a postcolonial perspective to a field of studies does not entail formulating a theoretical approach that examines the relationship between former colonizers and colonized, nor does it only require developing new tools to reread colonial history and culture. Utilizing a postcolonial approach to the study of literature, in this case of literature, entails including international literature recent and not so recent narratives by subjects and their descendants that have systematically produced counter-histories and counter-epistemologies of previously consolidated narratives. It also entails exposing how imaginary have been forged on and grounded in colonial systems of power that are reproduced and reinforced in contemporary postcolonial society. Such relationships of power are the result of colonial systems that have informed the history of Europe as a continent and of individual colonizing countries, but also of European countries that never had a colonial history, but were nevertheless pervaded by colonial imaginary and used racializing systems. Similarly, Italian postcolonial literature is not limited to the texts produced by migrant writers and by writers of subsequent generations whose families originated from Italian who therefore had a direct colonial relationship with Italy, but also include writers originating in colonial systems at large who had or have an indirect colonial relationship. The reason why I'm special is because it is still something that I find quite often that people, that when we speak about the post-colonial relationship, we're speaking about the direct relationship that exists between a colony and the ex-colonizers and colonized, whereas post-colonial exceeds this notion of direct relationship and instead is more informed by the idea of a colonial system that does not only entail a direct relationship between ex-colony and ex-colonizers and ex-colonized. The prefix post in postcolonial, Cristina Lombardi Diopen and I have specified in the introduction to postcolonial Italy, functions not merely as a temporal marker. Writing postcolonial literature does not mean so much writing after colonialism, rather it implies writing against. It means rewriting colonial history from the point of view of the colonized, also to unveil the multiple legacies of colonialism in contemporary societies, such as racism and the policies to limit the access to space and citizenship. To this purpose, the direct or indirect postcolonial relationship that writers and intellectuals entertain with Italy does not seem all that relevant. Writers who have a direct postcolonial connections with Italy, however, can hold a privileged position since they share a familiarity with the history, culture, and language of Italy. Their role thus has been and continues to be crucial in the rewriting of Italian colonial history. The mapping and periodization of Italian postcolonial literature that I have proposed elsewhere in the book that Angelica mentioned before, Interrupting Narrative and Intersectional Representations, and that I similarly propose here, is not intended as a rigid classification, but rather as an indication of a plurality of distinctive trajectories and common practices that are present in the four different phases into which my periodization is articulated. Considering this literary work as a corpus, however heterogeneous it may be, 35 years after the conventional date of the inception of Italian postcolonial literature, again 1990, can be deemed problematic. It is, after all, a process based on essentialism. While it is important to also incorporate individual authors into the broader context of Italian literature and culture, I believe that considering Italian postcolonial literature as a multifarious, diverse, creative body has a deeply cultural and political value, since, seen as a collective, this distinctive literary production empowers the collective counter-discourse that its authors articulate. legitimizing the collective counter-history narrate. So I will now proceed with reading, and I will say just a couple of things about each phase, because I would like to concentrate more on the last one of this phase, is the fourth one, for reasons that will become apparent. The first phase of Italian postcolonial literature, as I said, started in 1990 and finishes approximately in the mid-90s. And the three books that open, notoriously open phase in Italian postcolonial literature. In this case, this is the only case in which I have to use the expression migration literature, because this phase is almost entirely produced by migrant writers. The first three books all come out in 90, which is a very important year for Italy, because in 1990, February 1st, 1990, the first migration law is issued in Italy. So the famosa legge Martelli. So that is the first attempt by the Italian government to regulate the phenomenon of immigration. And so Papkuma, these authors, Papkuma makes clear what they wanted to do, what he wanted to do, but I think it's a collective answer in some way. In a conversation that he had with Grattella Parati, who conducted this interview in 1995, and when he asked what he wanted to do with this Io venditore di elefanti, which convention is the started Italian postcolonial literature, he said that volevo prendere la parola, I wanted to speak in the first person. And the reason why he said he wanted to do that is because he wanted to contrast all the narratives that appeared on migration that equated migration to undesirability and migrants to undesirable subjects. So he wanted to tell the story from the point of view of the migrant. As you see, there is always a collaboration in these texts. This is characterized by the fact that these are collaborative texts, from Papkuma to Farias d'Albuquerque's autobiographies, memoirs, and Mustaba and Meliti's texts are novels, although autobiographical novels, but all of them are written with the aid of an editor, some kind of journalist, cultural activist, and so on. However, there is a little, as you see, Maria Gachbatu, Ali Minaha Deshini Ramzan Fasel, who are part of that direct post-colonial writers I was mentioning before, because they are authors who come in some ways from Italian colonies and who therefore started the very difficult operation of rewriting Italian colonial history from the point of view of the colonists. The second phase is generally referred to as a phase of transitional phase, where there are some writers who disappear, some other writers who emerge, some become consolidated, but it's also a time when literary prize instituted, like for example the famous Etc. Prize for Migrant Writers, which was instituted in 1995, and then literary journals were founded, Caffè, one of them, El Ghibli, this happened later, though, Scritture Migranti, and some authors emerge, like for example, Gezi Majdari, he's an Albanian poet, Cristiana de Caldas Brito from Brazil, Jermila Ochkaiva from Slovakia, Yunis Tofik from Iraq, Lil Mabiala Gambo from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The third phase is the more complex, I think. It goes from the beginning of the third millennium until apparently 2018. There are many different trajectories and many different trends and many different groups of writers. It would be difficult to mention all of them, so I have indicated here only some of them. The one that I want to mention is Geneviève Macaping, this Traiettorie di sguardi se gli altri foste voi. I'll say a couple of words about this book and then some authors emerge who then become published, like Amara Lacous and Jadelaine Mabiala Gangbo, and then there are a number of authors like the holy trinity of post-colonial writing in Italian, so Giova Cego, Uba Cristina Rifara, and Gabriella Germandi. They all emerged between 2003. I think the first publication of Salsicce is then in Pecore Nere, but I think he won the Etc. Prize in 2003. And then the novels that make them famous, Giabascego, Roda, 2004, Cristina, Uba Cristina li fa, Madre Piccola, 2007, Gabriela Germandi, Regina di Fiori di Perle, 2008. And some of these novels, if then you're, maybe I can tell you which, some of these are translated, have been translated for many years. But then also I would like to remind the very important work of Kashibatu, Nasibu, Garane Garane, Shirizana Lifasel, Kara Mohamed, and Tini Hassan. She is the voice in the narrative. She's not the author. That is problematic, but we'll leave it now, of the historical novel Timira. And then there is a very important group of authors of Albanian origins, and their names you find here. Gezi Majdari is a poet, Ron Kubati, Sidones Ibrahimi. They have all written several novels. Elvira Dones is also a filmmaker. Let's say a couple of things about this text. This text was first published in 2001. Its existence, its sheer existence is so important to me that this is the text that, in my mind, starts the third phase of Italian postcolonial literature. The book came out in 2001, was republished in 2022. This is the cover of the re-edition, the one that came out years ago. And it is also translated into English. This book is also translated into English, and you might be familiar with the film that came out, the documentary came out, that is by, the subject is by Simone Brioni, and the director is, oddio, Mutamid, the name? Elia Mutamid, exactly. And it's titled Maka. And this is, according to me, the turning point at the beginning of the millennium. This is an autobiographical text, but it's also an autobiographical text. Macapin uses her personal story as a starting point for a reflection on the processes of subjectivity construction for racialized subjects in colonial systems of powers. So what is important in this text is that this is not just an account of her personal experience. Some part of literature mostly it's been starting from the personal experience, so it's a very important step. But here's theorization of structural racism as such in Italian society, and so what it means to face what Filomena Essed defines as everyday racism. If I had the time, I would mention the importance of Pecore Nere, but I don't, so I will go instead to the fourth phase. You know, if we have the time later, maybe in the discussion, that is an important collection. But I would like to say a couple of things about this fourth phase that starts in September 2019. It's from September 2019 to April 2021. A number of volumes came out that are centered on the complex analysis of processes of sexualization, racialization, and structural race. This text exposes how the national space of Italy has been phenomenologically and structurally constructed as white, and how such structures are deployed to keep racialized bodies outside. At this stage, presentations of Italian blackness that intrinsically deconstruct white normativity are not new to Italian postcolonial literature. What is new is the development of intersectional theoretical production, informed by collective resentment resulting from the failed reform of legislation on Italian citizenship and from the spread of the Black Lives Matter movement in Italy. The most significant shift in the fourth phase involves the production of racial epistemology based on the personal experiences and on the theoretical reflections of the authors and rooted in an intersectional methodology. Such methodology is systematically developed and articulated for the first time within the Italian cultural context and in the Italian language. The reason why I mentioned Macapin before and her importance is because that is the first instance in which there is a theory coming from a Black Italian author. But that is an isolated case. What is different in this fourth phase, in my mind, is that it starts being more systematical. Such methodology is systematically developed and articulated for the first time within the Italian cultural context and in the Italian language. These authors thus participate in a broader transnational conversation on the intersection of race, color, gender, class, sexuality, and citizenship, feminists of color in different European and non-European countries, promoting the decentering of the United States in the production of critical race studies. The volume that opens this fourth phase is Future, il domani narrato dalle voci di oggi, which comes in September 2019, edited by Giabascego, the first anthology composed in its entirety of the work of female and non-binary Black Italian writers, African and Caribbean descent. The texts included in the anthology are as heterogeneous as the narrative forms are hybrid, ranging from fictional to autobiographical narratives, from memoirs to critical essays. These authors write as racialized subjects, highlighting connections between their present and the colonial past, analyzing the psychological repercussions of racism in its heavy legacy, and exposing how the realization of racism and the consequent rejection of one's blackness create deep intergenerational fracture, which in turn deprive younger generations of their past and their history. I will, as I said before, I will speak a little bit about this. I will just like to show you some of the important books that came out. It's not even half of them, but just some of them. This is Esperanza Cusimana at the time, Ripanti. Now she's not using the Ripanti family name anymore. And this is a manifesto di una donna nera italiana. So it's a very autobiographical text, but it's written in the form of a manifesto. Jarakan, Ladri di Denti, which is published, well, this is published short after Future, and this is published at the beginning of 2020. Jarakan, she's a very, very light and critical voice in the Italian context. It's a collection of short stories, short reflections, memoiristic texts, theoretical reflections. Oisao Basui, Corpi Estranei, which is a reflection on how Black bodies in Italy are still considered as the Corpi Estranei, as foreign bodies, which also came out in 2020. These three books came out with the same publisher, People, in 6 months, all of them. And then this book has become quite popular. Nadisha Uyangoda, and this book was published by another 60 is the name of the publisher, in 2021. And she's also the author of a podcast which she recorded together with Natasha Fernando and Maria Catena Mancuso. The first season came out in 2021, the second on 2023. The title is Sulla razza, so about race. And it's a way to introduce the general public to the notion of race, which, as you know, is a very difficult category in the Italian cultural environment, and also is used as a way to actually supply the terminology necessary to speak about race, which is much uncertain, to say the least, in the Italian debate. Okay, so this most recent phase in Italian postcolonial literature is a complex and unprecedented theoretical production on race and on process of racialization in the Italian language and geopolitical context, written by Italian Black and other racialized women and non-binary subjects. The direct postcolonial relationship with Italy loses importance since the alt-right counter-narrative that exposed contemporary racism as a legacy of European colonial systems of power independently of direct and indirect colonial relationships. These authors do not merely announce the status quo, rather they articulate a collective response to structural racism and sexism, indicating trajectories that allow for different collective imaginaries to be shaped. I would now proceed with the presenting a case study, Future, as I said before, the anthology Future, and to remark why this collection initiates this fourth phase, a new phase of Italian postcolonial literature. That is, I would like to say very briefly what it does differently from what has been done before, and how is an intersectional and postcolonial perspective. The anthology Future is a collection of diverse narratives edited by Giabashego as 2019, featuring the work of 11 women and non-writers. You see the list here. And it also features 3 densely theoretical paratexts authored by Giabashego, editor's note, Camilla Hawthorne, the preface, and Prisca Agustoni afterward. In the preface, cultural geographer Camilla Hawthorne underlines the importance of African Italian women participating in a major debate on gender, race, and color with other Black European women to analyze the specific context of different European countries and of Europe as a whole, countering the central position of the United States in the articulation of race studies and the predominance of the English language in the field. Volume, Hawthorne argues, repositions Europe at the core of the racial question and becomes part of a European Black genealogy initiated by the volume Showing Our Colors, Afro-German Women Speak Out, which came out in German, in divided Germany before 1986 with the title Farbe bekennen. The first collection texts by Black feminists from a non-Anglophone European country, written in a language other than English. As stated in the title, the collection centered on the notion of futurity. Racism affects the perception of a temporality that for racialized subjects equal mobility, and I'm quoting from Ouedraogo here, a fixed present that grips them as if they were in quicksand, un presente fisso che li attanaglia come se fossero tra le sabbie mobili, end of quote. Letizia Ouedraogo, this is from Letizia Ouedraogo Nasantenga, which means Europe in the Mossi language of Burkina Faso. The temporality outlined in the anthology, however, is not a linear trajectory leading to a modernity from which Black people have historically excluded. The importance of memory and the exploration of the past are addressed as necessary in order to build a solid future. For racialized subjects, becoming acquainted with their past might imply excavating family histories and discovering the consequences of physical and psychological abuse, of colonialism and slavery, of structural racism. In Future, whiteness is decentered and white privilege is exposed. Racism is denounced as pervading the structure of society in the memoristic text by Marie-Moïse and Letizia Ouedraogo, which articulate Fanonian analysis of the complex psychological repercussions suffered by racialized subjects, which, as we might know, it was analyzed by Frantz Fanon in the context of Algeria and French colonialism. In Alessa Herrero's short story, the author references Grada Quilombo's notion that slavery and colonialism leave scars in the minds and bodies of racialized people who do not have their knowledge of either, but who inherit from their ancestors the trauma that results from these experiences. The devastating psychological effects of traumas, Moïse and Ouedraogo claim, are also likely to compromise intergenerational relationships. If in Pecore Nere, which I didn't have time to analyze, the terms of the conflict between first and second generation Italians are ironically exemplified and reduced to the choice of serving chicken or pasta to guests for dinner, or to the desire to store one's possessions in a permanent set rather than in impermanent suitcases. In Moïse and Ugo, the protagonists deal with traumatized fathers who have been symbolically emasculated and deprived of their roles as the patres familias. Psychological traumas are more likely to be inflicted upon subjects whose ties with the land of origin have been severed and who, as a result, have no sense of history and ancestry, as becomes apparent in Kant's fictional story, Il mio nome. When an affluent aunt visits from Ghana, the protagonist and Lisbeth becomes acquainted for the first time with her family's country of origin, which her parents have tried so hard to eradicate from their memories in their attempt at integration. The protagonist acknowledges her erasure and mimicry as a form of internalized racism that begins to surface in racialized subjects when they attend the Italian school system, which systematically negates the culture of immigrants and their children, thus reducing one's roots and solidity. The importance of such past experiences surfaces in the collection through the presence of public, personal, and family archives, like, for example, in Angelica Pizzolini's Travide Speranza Alcuna, or in Lucia Gebreghiorghes' Zek, which generate counter-official processes of memorialization and help to construct collective memories from below. The anthology Future is characterized by a profound discontinuity with the Italian cultural literary landscape. Through the genres of the memoir and personal essay, which merge autobiographical narratives and theoretical approaches rooted in personal lived experiences, the authors in the collection give shape to memories, both individual and collective, and reconstruct history from below. Denouncing the intersection of sexism and racism that Black women in their everyday lives in Italy, this collection traces transnational trajectories in the European context, not only with the seminal texts from the past, which I showed before, showing our color, but also with groundbreaking texts from such as the Black European Feminist Collection, To Exist is to Resist. I don't think I have, no. I didn't have a photo of the cover. To Exist is to Resist is the name of this feminist collection, Black European Feminist Collection. Future also places the history and the daily lives of Black Italians at the center of the Black Mediterranean history, simultaneously connecting it with the Black Atlantic and centering European narratives on, and I'm quoting from the introduction to Black Mediterranean, on transgressive practices of Black space making, creative forms of resistance and new subjectivities, end of quote, that no longer rely on universal literary models of male whiteness. My concluding remarks. In recent decades, incoming migrations from across the globe have radically altered the fabric of Italian society, connecting Italy's present to its history, colonialism, outgoing migrations, and to more recent mobilities, and which over time have disseminated Italian culture, language, memories, and imaginaries around the world. These and mobilities have incisively redefined the very notion of Italian national identity and culture. Starting in the last decade of the second millennium, literary representations of the social changes occurring in Italy have been produced by incoming migrants and their descendants. A postcolonial approach to these narratives makes the persistence of colonial systems of power in contemporary Italian society and culture, such as structural racism and mechanisms of marginalization and exclusion, thus initiating a decolonizing process. This approach also creates new imaginaries and promotes a more equitable society, supporting the reform of the law for the acquisition of Italian citizenship and deconstructing the chromatic norm of Italian whiteness. Such civilization of Italian culture, which will gradually render the very existence of a designated cultural space for Italian postcolonial literature unnecessarily and obsolete, will also require Italy to reconceive itself as the diverse and plural society it has been since antiquity, and will prompt mainstream Italian culture and academic institutions to acknowledge the relevance of migrant and postcolonial authors' voices and their power to represent Italian national culture in its multifarious expressions. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you so much, such an enriching lecture. We have a few minutes for questions. I know there was a lot to take on
Yeah,
board.
I know, that's
But
why.
this is the richness of the field we are talking about,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
Does it-
yeah, I kind of wanted to, for people who are in the field, they or probably know these kind of things, but maybe for people who are not exactly in the field, I think it's not easy to imagine how much is out there and what kind of complexity and richness Italian postcolonial constitutes in the Italian environment. Okay.
Okay.
Change.
Do we have any questions? Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Romeo. First of all, very enlightening as always. I'm maybe it's a naive question, but I'm thinking in terms of creative writing. I'm thinking, for example, Jabba Shego has a background of an academic, graduated from Villa Mirafiori, the faculty, and then she had a PhD. And I imagine some of these authors don't have an academic background, so they really are creative writers, if I may say that. Are there any differences, or can we differentiate streams in terms of talking back to power, let's put it that, or to the colonizer,
You mean
whether the writer has an academic background or not?
Yeah, meaning that I think that what differentiates what I have defined as the fourth phase of Italian postcolonial literature is, as I said, the fact that racism is not just represented, but it's theorized. So there is a production of theory of race theory that comes from Italy, and that what is different in that generation. That's why I want to have that case study, because that volume, generations of students, of Italian students, have read that volume, because I think it's a very important volume now, because something happens in this collection. And what I think makes the difference is not all of them, but the children of the children have now peers, and they have studied international relationships, and they have studied many fields, and they started their theorization. Geneviève Macapin also has a doctorate in anthropology. So that is, of course, it doesn't necessarily, not only people who have a PhD theorize, of course, but I think that there is a difference between what happens before and this phase that becomes really a theoretical, with an intersectional approach, in which the discrimination connected to gender and to race are intersected and considered in their intersection. Also, I was mentioning Fanon, I was mentioning Grada Quilomba, because they mentioned them. So it's clear that there is some colonial theory, not some, a lot of post-colonial theory that at this point is known. I have not, I have not met, like, for example, the very important work that some of these, Marie Moïse, for example, for one, but they're doing a very important work in the field of translations. They're translating, I can't even all of them, but Colette Guillaumin, for example. Say it again? Angela Davis, exactly. So there is a lot of feminist theoretical work done on race, different directions, that is now translated by some of these authors, some of the authors that are in Future, and also from other authors. So I think that that generations, of course, establishes a different perspective in what happens in Italian postcolonial literature.
We have another question.
Hi there. Thank you for the lecture. We mentioned in Il mio nome Bajarakan the consequences of severing ties with their land, right? It's a direct consequence of colonialism. My question is, what are the potential psychological repercussions of such thing? Not feeling like belonging to a particular place because in Italy you're told certain things and you sever ties with your motherland. The sense of ambiguity that comes from not knowing where you're at, which is what many migrants struggle with. Could there be any further psychological consequences associated with the state, or is it just merely a sense of in adaptation to the system?
Thank you. I think it's much more complex than just, of course, that has been explored. What I think what they do, okay. Also in this collection, I mentioned Frantz Fanon. We've done a lot of work on the psychological consequences of colonialism, and on the psychological example, Ouedraogo's Nasantenga, from which I was quoting before, analyzing the relationship between a father who has been deprived of the authority of being a father in the family. How this creates a relationship with the next generation that is tainted by the pain, not only by the pain, but by the shame of being shamed in the face of your children whom you tend. That's why I was mentioning this figure of the pater familias, which is evoked by Marie Moise. And I think what they do, especially in this collection, especially Marie Moise and Laetitia Ouedraogo, is precisely going beyond the obvious sense of displacement of migrants. I say obvious because, of course, it's something that emerges every narrative of migration in a way or another, not just as the only trait, but as something which is there because you are, between a place and another place. You're not quite rooted you're not quite uprooted from the other one, and to see instead how when migration is intersected with racism, so you don't just migrate, but you migrate to a land where then you become a subject, which you were not before, of course. So how this complicates the sense of being of people who are now in a different environment in which they are racialized, and what kind of relationships they can build with the next generations. Ouedraogo also mentioned something which I've always found very interesting, saying that as the children of traumatized, she was part of the community in which they were all children who were in very difficult relationships to with their parents because of the trauma that their parents had gone through and all traumas that they had experienced. But when they wanted to seek psychological treatment, so they wanted to go in therapy. This was something that therapists were not able to do because racism is nothing that was discussed in society, which made me think of, the autocoscienza groups in the 70s where women, the problem, there was a social problem with feminism and the role of women in society, but psychologists were not able to understand what that meant. And so Ouedraogo speaks about these groups that they had among the children of trauma, in which the therapy they had was a group therapy that they had with each other. So I think that also the idea that Marie Moise uses, that you don't, even if you were not racialized, even if you were not in a colonial system, you inherited the trauma of those experiences. They're not in your personal history, but they're in the history of your family. And so what happens even if that story, which appears, surfaces in Marie Moise's short story more, even if you don't know about the story is sometimes, it hurts in some way. Your body hurts until you understand why that is happening, why your body's hurting, because you have inherited stories that are very painful. Sure.
Thank you, Caterina, and I also echo Angelica's enthusiasm for having you here. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, a point that came back in your presentation is the importance of work, and particularly also in the title. And you mentioned the importance of the press exposed in Postcolonial, and it made me think what you said about it is not writing after, but it's writing against it. And I'm thinking how, when you wrote, as also Angelica mentioned, when you wrote together with, when you edited of essays, Postcolonial Italy, together with Cristina Lombardi Diop, it was kind of like that book that went the field for, in the case of Italy. But now that the word post-coloniality, post-colonialism, it's also moving from the academia to, for example, social media, to wider discussions together with decoloniality, to the point that they have become almost buzzwords. And in doing so, they lose the power that they have. So how do you see the relationship between a post-colonial lens and the decolonial lens? Are they acting on the same level, or although talk about post-colonial Italy and post-coloniality and decoloniality, or is there a temporal relationship between post-coloniality and decolonization, for example, that one comes first and then decolonization, for example, comes after?
You say, when you say decolonialization, you mean the decolonial paradigm?
Yes.
Because I have to admit that I always find it very difficult to understand how to use a decolonial approach in Italy, except when you analyze the subaltern of the South. For example, I have a brilliant, she's no longer my graduate student, she's no longer a graduate student, she graduated, and she wrote a very important dissertation on applying a decolonial perspective to the South, and to write about the South with a post-colonial, decolonial, queer approach. So that is something that I can see, but I think that the way it is easier for me to include the decolonial perspective to analyze Italy is when we approach the subalternity of the South, because after all, I think that decolonial theory is something that comes from the so-called global South. So there are trajectories that actually keep them together, decolonial perspective. And when we analyze, for example, decolonial feminism, Maria Lugones, for example, together with critical feminism, for example. So otherwise, I don't, and it's actually, I'm thinking of Rachele Borghi's volume, I don't remember the title, but it's about decolonial, and because we know that post-colonial, has been criticized, the term has been criticized, the notion, the fact that it's been an academic perspective that doesn't come from the people, but comes from the academia. So, and it's, there are a number of these criticisms that I can share, but I still think that it's I think, in fact, that this is a very important perspective still in Italy, because I can see that that the connection existing between contemporary racism and the way of conceiving of contemporary racism as a legacy of colonialism is still not very much in the discourse. It's lost, and I think that finding that connection help us interpret what is happening in the present, if we are interested, because sometimes, it seems to me that we're not very interested in really understanding what's happening in the present. But if we are, I think that is a key to understanding that kind of connection, to see how these practices survive in the present. So I think that.
Thank you, Caterina. We are kind of running out of time, but we have a reception downstairs. So if you have further questions, we will be there. But let's give un applauso a Caterina Romeo.
Molto grazie. Grazie.